The conference chamber stretched so high that Lisa Morgan could barely see the ceiling, and she stood at the human podium with her hands gripping the edges tightly, because this was the moment that would change everything. Though nobody in the massive room seemed to care much about what she was going to say, and that bothered her more than she wanted to admit. Lisa had been preparing this speech for 3 months, and she had checked every number twice and reviewed every calculation with the best scientists humanity had, and the message was clear and urgent and terrifying. But as she looked around the chamber at the hundreds of alien species gathered there, she could see that most of them were not even paying attention to her. The dimensional fractures are expanding, and Lisa began speaking into the translator device that would carry her words to all the species in their own languages, and she kept her voice steady, even though her heart was pounding, because she knew how important this was, and she continued by saying that their research stations had detected 47 new breach points in the last cycle alone, and if they did not act immediately, they were looking at a cascade failure within 5 standard years. Ambassador Zolth of the Vreen made a sound that the translator turned into laughter, and he said something about humans always predicting the end of the world, and he asked Lisa if this was like the Corvin Nebula warning or the stellar drift crisis, and his tone made it clear he thought both of those had been false alarms. Lisa felt her jaw tighten, and she reminded him that those situations had resolved because humans had fixed them, and she told him that human engineering teams had spent 18 months stabilizing the Corvin Nebula and that 6 people had died doing that work, and her voice cracked slightly when she mentioned the deaths, because one of those people had been her friend Sharp Thought, who was a being made of living crystal, spoke up and said that humans always wanted credit for doing basic work that any species could do, and he said humans were not special, and the way he said it made Lisa realize that this was not just about the current crisis, but about decades of resentment that had been building up around the chamber. Other representatives continued their side conversations and barely paid attention, and Lisa realized with growing frustration that she was wasting her time because nobody was going to listen, and nobody was going to help. And this was exactly how it had been for the past 30 years. She tried one more time and explained that they needed a coordinated response with full resource allocation and temporal shielding around critical infrastructure, and complete evacuation protocols for affected sectors, and she stressed that this required everyone working together. First Speaker Kalmoth, who was the leader of the entire Galactic Council and stood 3 times taller than Lisa, looked down at her and simply said the word denied, and he explained that the Council had reviewed the human proposal and found the resource allocation excessive and unnecessary, and he said humanity could proceed with its own protective measures if it wished, but the Council would not divert resources based on speculative models. Lisa had known this was coming, but hearing it still hurt, and she reached into her jacket and pulled out a small data chip and held it up so everyone could see it, and she said this chip contained all their research and predictions and proposed solutions, and she was submitting it to the official record. She placed the chip on the podium with great care and said that when the fractures reached critical mass, the Council would know that humans had tried to warn them, and her voice was quiet. But Firm Zolth made another dismissive sound and said that humans were always playing the victim, and several other representatives laughed at that. Lisa looked around the chamber one final time, and she saw the same expression she had seen for years, and it was contempt mixed with indifference, and she thought about Kyle, who had died in the Corvin Nebula, and how the Council had not even mentioned his name in their reports, and she thought about all the other humans who had given their lives fixing problems that the Council created through neglect and laziness. She said goodbye very quietly, though the translator did not pick it up, and she turned and walked toward the exit. And behind her, the Council moved on to discussing fishing rights in some sector, and nobody seemed to notice or care that she was leaving. 3 weeks passed, and Lisa sat in her quarters on Sentinel Prime, which was a human space station that orbited at the very edge of Council space, and she was watching a recording of another Council meeting. And this time she was not there because humanity had recalled all its ambassadors. Greg Palmer sat next to her, and he was reviewing reports from human colonies across 12 sectors. And he told her that the vote had been unanimous and every human settlement and station and ship had agreed to the plan. Lisa asked what the margin was, and Greg said 87% voted for immediate withdrawal, and 11% wanted to give the Council one more chance, and 2% did not vote. And he looked at her and said she had been right to call for the vote, because people were tired of being treated like servants. On the screen, the Galactic Council was debating something trivial, and the human delegation seats were empty because humanity had recalled everyone 2 days earlier. But nobody on the council had even mentioned it. Yet Lisa asked if Earth Central had responded, and Greg smiled and said that Director Chen had sent her approval that morning and had said it was about time. And he explained that the logistics were challenging because humans had 17,000 installations across council space, including research stations and engineering platforms and medical facilities and schools. Lisa said they did not need to move everything because humans had built most of it with their own resources anyway, and she said they would take what was irreplaceable and leave the rest, and the council could figure out how to maintain it themselves. Greg pointed out that some of those systems were critical for survival, and he mentioned that the Tertian homeworld depended on atmospheric processors that humans had installed, and that the Bellisgate network needed constant calibration that only human engineers knew how to do. Lisa said she knew that, but she reminded him that humans had offered to share that knowledge hundreds of times, and the council had always refused because they said they did not want to become dependent on human technology, and now they would have to learn the hard way. Over the next 2 months, something unprecedented happened across the galaxy, though almost nobody noticed. At first because humans were very quiet about it. Human research stations began shutting down and their crews packed up decades of work and left for unknown destinations, and human engineers resigned from projects on 1,000 worlds, and human doctors closed their clinics, and human teachers left their classrooms, and they all just disappeared. On Vex Prime, the human maintenance team that was responsible for the planetary shield grid simply did not show up for their shift, and the supervisor assumed they were sick, and it took 3 days before someone checked their quarters and found them empty and clean. With a note saying their contracts had ended, the human district on Trader's Haven became empty over the course of 1 week, and shops closed and apartments were vacated, and the humans who had lived there for generations just left, and other species quickly moved in to claim the valuable space. And they joked about how humans could not handle real competition. At the Galactic Medical Research Center, a human doctor named Alan handed over his research files to his colleague and explained that the Galaxian plague vaccine was nearly complete, and he outlined the remaining work that needed to be done. His colleague looked confused and asked if Alan was taking vacation time, and Alan said no, he was leaving permanently. And when asked where he was going, Alan just said he was leaving, and he wished his colleague good luck, and walked out. In the council building itself, the human offices were spotless and empty, and the furniture was covered and files were carefully archived, and it looked like a museum rather than a working space. One janitor mentioned to another that the humans were probably just rotating staff, but there were no new humans coming, and there were no humans anywhere, and slowly people began to realize that something strange was happening. Lisa watched it all from Sentinel Prime, and she monitored the reports from every corner of human space, and the exodus was going smoothly, because humans were excellent at planning and organizing and executing complex operations, and that was one of their most underappreciated talents. Greg told her they were receiving inquiries from minor species, asking if humans were really leaving, and some of them sounded worried. Lisa said to tell them the truth, which was that humanity was consolidating resources and focusing on human interests, and that humans were done being the galaxy's maintenance crew. Some species asked if they could come with the humans, and that surprised Lisa, because she had not considered that possibility. Greg told her that the Kelmer and the Free Traders Union and a few others wanted to join humanity, and these were species that did not have much power in the council and ones that humans had worked closely with for years. Lisa thought about it carefully and said to tell them that humanity would consider requests on a case-by-case basis, but they needed to understand that where humans were going, there would be no council protection and no infrastructure, and it would be difficult. Greg said quietly that some of them were more afraid of staying without humans than going into the unknown. The Bellisgate network was the pride of galactic civilization, though most people did not know that humans had designed every part of it and built every gate and maintained every system for nearly a century, because the official record said it was a collaborative project between multiple species, which was technically true, if collaboration meant humans doing all the work while others took the credit. Jenny Brooks had spent 15 years calibrating the gates in Sector 7, and she understood the mathematics better than anyone, and she knew exactly how the quantum fields interacted and what kind of balance was needed to keep everything stable. And she had tried many times to train engineers from other species, but most of them found the work boring, and refused to commit the time necessary to learn it properly. Now she stood in a cargo bay watching her equipment being loaded onto a transport ship, and through the window she could see Bellis Prime Station, which was the central hub controlling the entire gate. Network Pete Johnson stood beside her and asked if she was having second thoughts, and Jenny said no. She was not having second thoughts about leaving. But yes, she was worried about what would happen to the Network Pete. Reminded her that they had tried to train other species for years and those species had never taken the training seriously. Jenny knew that was true. But she also knew that billions of people depended on the gate network for everything from food, shipments to medical supplies to just visiting family on other worlds, and when the network failed, those people would suffer. Pete said that was not their responsibility anymore, and his voice was firm, but Jenny could hear the doubt underneath because he felt the same conflict she did. The first gate failure happened 17 days after the last human engineer left Bellis Prime. Gate 471, which serviced the Trax homeworld, simply stopped working in the middle of a transit and a cargo. Ship carrying medical supplies was caught halfway through and its molecules were spread across 2 points in space. And everyone on board died instantly, though it took 6 hours for anyone to figure out what had happened. The council sent their best engineers to investigate. And these were Vreen and Zareen and Kalax technicians who had always claimed they understood human technology better than humans did. They spent 3 weeks examining the gate and studying the systems and running tests, and their conclusion was that the gate needed recalibration, but the calibration protocols were extremely complex, and they managed to get the gate working again at 73% efficiency, which they announced as a great success. 2 months later, Gate 471 failed again, and this time it was permanent, and the Trax homeworld was cut off from the rest of the galaxy, and now travel there required conventional ships that took weeks instead of the minutes that Gates provided. The council issued a statement saying the failure was due to unexpected quantum degradation, and they assured everyone that the network was otherwise stable and safe. 3 weeks after that, 5 more gates failed within days of each other on Sanctuary Station. A young researcher named Treven was trying to finish the work that Alan had started on the Galaxian plague vaccine. But he was running into problems because the test subjects were developing severe neurological symptoms, and 3 people had already died. Treven kept reading through Alan's notes looking for answers, and the documentation was incredibly thorough and detailed. But there were gaps where Alan had written things like standard isolation procedure, or using the usual baseline correction factors. Treven had assumed these were basic things that any good researcher would know, but he was discovering that human standard procedures were built on centuries of accumulated knowledge and techniques that had been passed down through generations and refined over time. He tried to contact Alan, but the communication channel was dead, and he tried other human researchers he had worked with, but all their contact information was invalid. Humanity had vanished completely, and they had taken all their knowledge with them. Treven's supervisor told him they needed to stop the trials because without understanding human methodology, they were just guessing and people were dying. Treven said bitterly that people were already dead. And meanwhile, the Galaxian plague was spreading with 16 new cases just that week. His supervisor had no answer. The atmospheric processors on Tertia Prime started failing in the 4th month after humans left, and the planet had been terraformed 2 centuries ago, but its atmosphere was unstable and required constant maintenance to remain breathable. The human engineering team had managed these processors for generations, and each generation had trained the next in the delicate and complex work. The Tertians had always resented this dependence, and they complained about it in council meetings and demanded that the technology be transferred to them, and they said it was insulting to rely on another species for something as basic as air. When humans offered to train Tertian engineers, the offers were declined, because it was a matter of pride, and surely Tertian scientists could figure it out themselves. When the processors began failing, Tertian scientists did try to understand the systems, and they took apart one of the smaller units and documented every component and attempted to rebuild it. And the rebuilt processor worked for 3 days before it exploded and killed 16 scientists. The remaining processors continued to break down, and the planetary government had to issue oxygen rations, and riots started in the cities as air quality dropped below safe levels. First Speaker Kalmoth finally called an emergency council session, and the chamber was only half full because travel had become difficult without the gate network. He said they needed to locate humanity and bring them back, and that this isolation had gone on long enough. Ambassador Vreen asked how they were supposed to do that when nobody knew where humans had gone, and all Their communication channels were closed and the colonies on the edge of council space were empty. And abandoned Skalth insisted humans could not have gone far because a species does not just disappear, and he said to send scout ships to find them. Scout ships went out and searched and found nothing, and the human colonies were indeed abandoned. But there were no clues about where the humans had gone, and no warp trails and no debris. And it was like 10 billion humans had simply stopped existing. 1. Science vessel spent a week orbiting Earth, which was humanity's homeworld, and they scanned for any sign of human presence and found nothing except automated systems still running and empty cities that looked like everyone had just left one day. Sharp thought said this was psychological warfare and humans were hiding and waiting for the council. To beg, Vreen said quietly that maybe they should beg because galactic civilization was collapsing and the gate network was down to 64%. Functionality and medical research had stopped completely, and industrial production was failing across 40 sectors because humans had maintained so many critical systems. Kalmuth asked how long until complete collapse. A statistical analyst checked her data and said at current rates they would lose all gate functionality in 18 months and maybe 2 years, until life support failures on multiple worlds, and 5 years until a genuine dark age. Another analyst added that this assumed nothing else went wrong, and if the dimensional fractures humans had warned about were real and kept expanding, they could face extinction-level events much sooner. Kalmuth stood up and his massive form dominated the chamber, and he said they would search every system and every corner of space until they found humanity and brought them back. Breen asked what they would do if humans refused to return. Nobody had an answer for that question. By the 6th month, the collapse had accelerated from gradual to catastrophic, and the Bellis Gate network was at 41% functionality, with gates failing faster than technicians could attempt repairs, and entire sectors were isolated and required weeks of travel to reach. The economic impact was devastating, because trade routes that had sustained civilizations for centuries were cut off overnight, and colonies that imported food were rationing, and stations that needed resource shipments were being evacuated on Trader's Haven. The new occupants of the human districts were learning why humans had maintained such a large technical staff, because the environmental systems were failing, and nobody knew how to repair them. The station director watched another system go critical, and his operations chief said they needed to evacuate and seal off the failing sections before losing the entire station. The director pointed out that those sections now housed 40% of the population and asked where those people would go. The operations chief said they would have to evacuate the entire station. The director asked where they would go when the nearest functional gate was 3 weeks away by conventional drive. Nobody had an answer. Similar situations were happening across the galaxy, and the Tertians had stabilized their processors at 60% functionality, which meant 40% of their population could not breathe properly, and mass evacuations were starting. But moving billions of people without the gate network was nearly impossible. The Galaxian plague vaccine trials were permanently stopped after 17 deaths, and the plague kept spreading to 18 worlds, and without human medical knowledge the containment was failing, and then the dimensional fractures started. Becoming visible, Dr. Nixall was an astrophysicist who had dismissed human warnings as the silence from humanity was its own form of communication, and every day without a response made the message clearer, because either humans were not listening, or they were listening and choosing not to respond, and neither possibility offered any comfort to the dying galaxy. First speaker. Kalmuth had aged terribly in the 6 months since the crisis began, and he stood in his private chambers watching news feeds from across the galaxy, and every screen showed another disaster and another failure and another tragedy that could have been prevented if only they had listened. Zalth spent most of his time with Kalmuth now, partly because they had become unlikely friends through shared crisis, and partly because his own world was being evacuated and he had nowhere else to go. Zalth said that humans were making them wait on purpose, and this was deliberate psychological torture. Kalmuth said perhaps, or perhaps humans genuinely did not care anymore about what happened to the rest of the galaxy. Zalth said he could not believe that, because humans were emotional creatures who cared too much if anything, and that had always been their weakness. Kalmuth turned to face him and asked if it had been a weakness, or if it had been a strength that nobody understood until it was gone. On Trader's Haven, the evacuation was in its final stages, and of the 200,000 beings who had lived on the station, only 30,000 remained, and they were desperately trying to keep core systems running long enough for everyone else to escape. Station Director Kelvin worked 18-hour shifts and slept in his office when he slept at all, and he had been reading through old maintenance logs trying to understand how humans had kept everything running so smoothly for so long. What he found shocked him because humans had not just maintained the systems, but had been constantly upgrading them and improving them, and often using their own money and resources to fix problems that were not technically their responsibility. Notes in the margins showed engineers staying late to calibrate sensors, and technicians spending their free time training junior staff from other species, and managers quietly covering supply shortfalls from personal funds when council budgets fell short. Kelvin said to his operations chief that humans had kept them alive, and showed her the logs, and explained that all those years they had complained about human presence and about how humans took up too much space and were paid too much, and the whole time humans were keeping the station running with their own resources, and nobody had even noticed. His operations chief looked at the logs and then at the failing systems around them and said they had taken humans for granted. Kelvin said they had done worse than that, and they had resented humans for helping them. The station shuddered as another system failed and the gravity generators struggled to compensate, and they had, maybe 1 week, before the station became completely uninhabitable. The operations chief asked quietly if anyone would remember, and she wondered if when the station was gone, and they were scattered across whatever worlds would take them, whether anyone would remember what they had here and what they lost. Kelvin did not answer because he did not know. The dimensional fracture in the Palax sector had consumed 17 inhabited worlds before it finally stabilized, and 3 billion people died, and most of them never understood what killed them, because one moment their worlds existed and the next moment everything was gone and erased from reality, as if it had never been. Dr. Nixall watched it happen through her sensors and recorded every data point and every measurement, and if humanity ever returned, at least they would have information about what happened. Though that was small consolation for billions of deaths, her assistant reported another fracture, and his voice was hollow from weeks of witnessing death on an unimaginable scale, and he said it was in Sector 9 near the Vreen. Homeworld Nixall checked the data, and her heart sank because this fracture was smaller, but growing faster. And if the pattern held, they had maybe 3 weeks before critical mass. She told him to notify the council and begin evacuation protocols for Sector 9. Her assistant said that was the Vreen homeworld with 40 billion people living there. Nixall said she knew and told him to notify the council. Anyway, the evacuation of the Vreen homeworld was complete chaos because only 19% of the gate network still worked, and conventional ships needed weeks to travel between systems, and there was no possibility of saving everyone, and the best-case scenario involved rescuing maybe 10% of the population. Ambassador Vreen worked constantly coordinating evacuation efforts, and she knew her own family was still on the homeworld waiting in the queue, and they were priority level 7, which meant they had about a 5% chance of getting off-world before the fracture consumed everything. She could have used her position to move them up the list, but she did not because other people needed those spaces more than her. Family did on the 3rd week as the fracture grew to critical size. Vreen received a final message from her mother, and it was simple and said they were proud of her and asked her to tell everyone that they had existed and that they were here. The fracture consumed the Vreen homeworld 17 hours later, and 40 billion lives vanished in an instant, and a civilization that had existed for 12,000 years was reduced to 4 billion survivors scattered across refugee camps throughout. The Galaxy Vreen did not cry because she could not afford to, and she simply marked her family as deceased in the official records and went back to work. That night alone in her quarters, she finally watched the human warning video that Lisa had submitted nearly a year ago, and she watched Lisa explain the dimensional fractures and the predicted timeline and the proposed solutions, and she watched the data that was clear and undeniable, showing exactly what would happen if they did not act. The video had been marked as reviewed and filed by council staff with no action taken. Vreen found Lisa's contact information, and it was inactive as expected, but she recorded a message anyway. She said that Lisa had been right about everything and they should have listened, and she did not expect Lisa to respond or help because they did not deserve it. But she wanted Lisa to know that at least one person understood now what they had in humanity, and she wanted to say she was sorry for whatever that was. Worth, she sent the message into the void, not knowing if any human would receive it. On Sentinel Prime, Lisa did receive the message, and she watched it alone late at night when the station was quiet. Greg had been standing in the doorway and heard the message play, and he said Lisa should respond. Lisa asked what she should say. Greg suggested saying they forgave them, or that they would help, and he said he did not know. But something seemed necessary. Lisa replayed the message and watched Vreen's face and could see the exhaustion and the grief and the understanding that came far too late to matter. Lisa said the hardest part of all this was knowing they could help because they had the technology and the knowledge, and they could save billions of lives with what they had built, but they were choosing not to. Greg said it was because the council chose not to listen when it mattered. Lisa said yes, but that did not make it feel any better, and it just made everyone complicit in the tragedy. Greg asked what they should do. Lisa was quiet for a long time and finally said they would wait and watch and remember this the next time someone told them. Their warnings did not matter. She deleted Vreen's message without responding. The dimensional fractures continued appearing across the galaxy, and 3 more homeworlds were consumed along with 12 major trade hubs and hundreds of stations and colonies, and the death toll climbed into the hundreds of billions. The gate network was down to 7% functionality, and medical systems had collapsed entirely, and food production was failing across 30 sectors, and the galactic economy that had taken thousands of years to build disintegrated in months. And through everything, humanity remained silent and invisible and unreachable. First Speaker Kalmuth called one final council session, and only 47 species representatives attended because the others were either dead or missing, or unable to travel to the council chamber. Kalmuth said they needed to acknowledge the truth, which was that their civilization was dying, and they had failed to listen to warnings from a species they considered beneath them, and now they were paying the price. And the question was simple, which was whether they should accept extinction with dignity or spend their final days desperately searching for salvation that might never come. Sharp thought diminished, but still Defiance stood and said they should continue searching and humanity must be found because humans owed them. Kalmuth roared that humans owed them nothing, and his voice silenced the chamber, and he said they owed humans, and they had owed humanity respect and gratitude and cooperation, but they gave only contempt, and this was not humanity's failure but theirs. Vreen stood and proposed creating a record and a complete history of what happened and why it happened and what they lost. And if any civilization survived this, or if humanity ever returned, they should know the truth. The proposal passed unanimously. The archive took 3 weeks to compile and contained everything, including council records and personal testimonies and technical analyses and cultural studies, and it was a comprehensive document of how a civilization failed and the catastrophic consequences that followed. The final entry was written by Kalmuth himself. He wrote that they had been the Galactic Council with 840. 15 months after humanity departed, Lisa stood in the observation deck of Sentinel Prime, looking out at the stars, and behind her the edge of what had been Galactic Council space glowed faintly with the light of dying civilizations and scattered fires burning across hundreds of worlds. The human fleet had grown substantially, and what started as a few hundred ships had become several thousand as more human outposts consolidated at their new location beyond the galactic rim, and they had built 3 new stations and established mining colonies on resource-rich asteroids, and even started terraforming a promising world they called New Earth. It should have felt like victory and like triumph because humanity was finally free from the obligations and disrespect of the Council, and they were building a new civilization on their own terms. Instead, it felt hollow and empty, and wrong. Greg entered the observation deck and said another message had come in from the Council archive stations, and they were broadcasting their historical record on repeat, hoping someone would preserve it. Lisa asked how many stations were left. Broadcasting. Greg said 3 stations were still active, and that was down from 47 the previous month. Lisa closed her eyes and thought about what 3 stations meant, which was thousands of beings clinging to life and using their last power reserves to shout their story into the void before the darkness took them too. Greg continued and said, the Earth Task Force had returned from their survey mission, and they found no structural damage to any cities, and all systems were still running on automatic power, and it was like everyone had just left for a short trip and never returned. Lisa said that was exactly what happened, because they left cleanly and efficiently with minimal damage, and they had not wanted to hurt anyone, and had only wanted to stop being hurt themselves. Greg said bitterly. That mission accomplished then, except. Now billions were dying and humans were safe and sound out here beyond the rim. Lisa turned to face him and asked what he wanted her to do, and whether he wanted them to go back and reveal themselves, and let the council use them again. And she said they would become even more enslaved than before. Greg said he was not suggesting going back, but maybe they could send help, and send anonymous shipments of medical supplies and technical manuals for maintaining critical systems, and something that did not require revealing themselves but might save lives. Lisa said they had debated this 100 times already. Greg said they would debate it 100 more because billions of people were dying. And yes, the council leaders had been arrogant and dismissive, and yes, humans were treated poorly. But the average person, like the factory worker on Vex Prime, or the teacher on Trader's Haven, or the child on the Vreen homeworld, had not made these decisions, and they were just caught in the collapse. Lisa was quiet for a long moment and finally said she knew that, and asked if Greg thought she did not know because she thought about it constantly. Greg pressed on and said that if they sent supplies, those people would become dependent again. And if they shared knowledge, the council would take it without gratitude, and if they revealed their location, the council would demand more, and they had seen this pattern for 3 generations. So why would anything be different? Now Lisa said maybe because they were desperate and because they had lost everything, and maybe that changed people. Greg pulled up a display showing long-range sensor data and said, or maybe it made them more dangerous, and he showed her 17 distinct groups actively searching for humanity, and not to apologize or negotiate but to locate resources, and they had intercepted communications talking about securing human assets and compulsory knowledge transfer, and they were planning to force humans to help if they found them. Greg said that even now, after everything, the council thought they could just take what they needed from humanity. Lisa said not everyone thought that way, and Ambassador Vreen's message had been genuine, and they had received others like it. But yes, the dominant attitude seemed to be that humans were obligated to save them, and that humanity's departure was somehow immoral, and that humans were responsible for their suffering. Greg asked if they were responsible. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Lisa said she genuinely did not know, and they had warned the council and offered solutions and tried to help for decades, and the council rejected everything. So at what point did their failure become their responsibility, instead of humanity's? Before Greg could respond, an alert sounded, and the communications officer's voice came through saying they were receiving a priority transmission, and it was different from the usual distress calls. Lisa asked how it was different. The officer said it was from a species called the Kelmer, and they were requesting permission to enter human space, and they said they had something important to show Lisa. And Greg exchanged glances, and the Kelmer were one of the minor species that had been marginalized by the council, and one of the groups that had asked about joining humanity during the Exodus. Lisa said to let them through under escort and with weapons ready, because if this was a trick, she wanted to be prepared. 3 hours later, a small Kelmer ship docked at Sentinel Prime, and its crew of 5 looked exhausted, and their ship was clearly running on failing systems, and they were led to a conference room where Lisa and Greg and several other senior officers waited. Kelmer captain, whose name translated as Bright River, placed a data core on the table and said this was the council archive, and it was the complete historical record of what happened, and they had been tasked with preserving it and distributing it to anyone who might find it relevant. Lisa said they already knew what happened because they had lived through it. Bright River said yes, but they might not know what was in the personal testimonies and the letters from people who realized too late what humanity meant to them, and the confessions from council members about dismissing warnings and the calculation showing how many lives could have been saved if they had just listened. He activated the core and holographic displays filled the room with data, and Lisa saw Vreen's face and saw her recording testimony and saw Kalmuth's final message, and saw thousands of personal stories from beings across the galaxy, all expressing the same regret. Lisa asked why they were showing this. To them, Bright River said because they needed to understand something important, which was that the people dying out there had mostly never known the truth about humanity's contributions, and the council controlled the narrative and minimized human achievements and took credit for human work and painted humans as merely adequate when they were exceptional. And these people were lied to by their leaders, and now they were paying with their lives. Greg said that did not change the fundamental problem, which was that if humans helped, they would become servants again. Bright River agreed that perhaps that was true, or perhaps the old order was dead and something new could be built, and the council was gone, and the old hierarchies were meaningless, and the survivors were scattered and humbled and desperate. And if humanity returned now, they would not be servants but saviors arriving from beyond the rim with knowledge and resources. To rebuild, Lisa said. Saviors became targets, and the moment the crisis passed, people would forget who helped them and only remember their resentment. Bright River gestured to the archive and said, "Then make them remember, and make the help conditional, and share knowledge only with those who acknowledged the truth and rebuild the gate network, but let humanity control it and provide medical aid, but let humanity train the doctors." And he said humanity had all the leverage now, and should use it to build something better than what existed before. Lisa studied the Kelmer captain carefully and asked why he cared. Because his species survived the collapse relatively intact. Bright River said quietly that the Kelmer had been in the same position as humanity once, and 300 years ago, the Kelmer were the Council's technicians and the ones who maintained systems nobody else wanted to deal with, and they were treated as servants and disrespected and taken for granted, and they tried to leave just as humans did, but they did not have the courage to go through with it, and they stayed and accepted their place and regretted it every day since. He leaned forward and said humanity did what the Kelmer could not, and they left, and they showed the entire galaxy what happened when the Foundation walked away, and it had been catastrophic, yes, but also educational. And people understood now in a way they never did before. That quiet workers who kept civilization running were just as important as leaders who took credit. The room fell silent. As everyone absorbed this, Lisa finally said they needed time to consider everything, and that Bright River and his crew could rest, and they would provide whatever supplies they could spare. After the Kelmer left, Lisa and her senior staff debated through the night, and arguments were fierce and emotions ran high, and some wanted to maintain isolation, arguing that humanity earned the right to build their own civilization free from outside obligations, and others argued they had a moral duty to help regardless of past treatment. The youngest officer present was a lieutenant named Chris, who had barely been an adult when the exodus began, and he asked if he could say something. Lisa nodded, and Chris said he had been listening to all the debate, and he kept thinking about what they were teaching the next generation. And his daughter was 7 years old, and she would grow up knowing that when the human fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel at the edge of what had been the Palax sector, and what greeted them was devastation on a scale that even their worst predictions had not fully captured, because the dimensional fracture had not just destroyed worlds but had twisted space itself into something unrecognizable. Lisa stood on the bridge of Sentinel Prime and looked at the sensor readings and felt her stomach turn, because where 17 inhabited worlds should have been, there was only emptiness, and not the normal emptiness of space, but something worse, which was an absence so complete that it seemed to pull at reality itself. Greg stood beside her reviewing deployment orders, and he said quietly that 3 billion people had lived here, and now there was nothing left, and not even debris or ruins, just nothing. Lisa said she knew, and her voice was barely a whisper. The fleet moved deeper into Council space, and everywhere they looked, they saw the same patterns of collapse and failure, and stations drifting dark and lifeless, and worlds struggling with failing infrastructure, and ships stranded without functional gates, and everywhere, people desperate and dying. The first contact came from Trader's Haven, and Station Director Kelvin's voice over the communication channel was rough with exhaustion, but also with hope, and he said that humanity had returned, and he asked if they were really here to help. Lisa responded and said yes, they were here to help, but things would be different this time, and she asked if Kelvin had received and understood the terms. Kelvin said he had received them and understood them completely, and he said on behalf of everyone remaining on Trader's Haven, he accepted humanity's terms without reservation, and he said they had been fools to treat humans as they had, and if humans were willing to help despite everything, then humans could set whatever terms they wanted. Lisa felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly, and she said they would send an engineering team immediately, and they would begin repairs to the station's core systems. Kelvin said thank you, and his voice broke, and he said those words inadequately expressed what he felt, but he did not know what else to say. Lisa said she understood, and the engineers would arrive within 6 hours. The engineering team that arrived at Trader's Haven was led by Pete, who had been part of the original Exodus, and who knew these systems better than anyone, because he had helped install many of them decades ago. Pete walked through the failing station with Kelvin, and what he saw made him angry because so much of the damage had been preventable. And if anyone had just followed the maintenance protocols that humans had carefully documented, then most of these systems would still be working. Kelvin saw the expression on Pete's face and said he knew they had failed. And he showed Pete the old maintenance logs and the notes that human engineers had left and said they had not understood until it was too late how much work humans had been doing. Pete looked at the logs and saw his own handwriting in some of them, and notes from colleagues and friends, and some who had died, and he felt the weight of all those years of unappreciated work. He said they would fix what could be fixed, and for the rest they would need to install new systems entirely, and it would take time. Kelvin said they had time now that humans were here, and whatever humans needed they would provide. Pete got to work and his team spread through the station, and slowly, carefully, they began bringing systems back online, and it was hard work and tedious and exactly the kind of work that humans had always done without recognition. But this time when Pete's team fixed something, the station crew thanked them and meant it, and that made a difference. Similar scenes played out across dozens of stations and worlds, and human medical teams arrived to help with plague outbreaks, and human engineers began the massive task of rebuilding the gate network, and human scientists shared their knowledge about the dimensional fractures and how to stabilize them. But not everyone welcomed humanity's return. On the world of cracks, the local government initially refused human help, and their leaders said they would not accept terms that placed humans in a position of authority, and they insisted their own engineers were capable of handling repairs. Lisa received their message and simply replied that humanity respected their choice, and the human ships assigned to cracks were reassigned elsewhere, and the fleet moved on. 2 weeks later, as Crax's environmental systems approached complete failure, the government sent another message. And this time they accepted humanity's terms and begged for help. Lisa sent a team, but she also sent a message that said, going forward, any world that rejected human aid would go to the bottom of the priority list because humanity had limited resources and would help those who wanted to be helped first. The message was clear, and it spread quickly through the remaining council networks, and after that the rejection stopped. The work of rebuilding was enormous, and humanity had perhaps 10,000 engineers and technicians and doctors available, and they needed millions to address all the galaxy's problems, and it would take years or decades to restore even basic functionality to most systems. Lisa called a meeting of all the human team leaders, 1 month into the reconstruction, and she asked for honest assessments of their progress. The reports were mixed, and some stations and worlds were recovering well and accepting human leadership and contributing their own resources to repairs, and others were struggling because they had lost too much infrastructure, and some were actively hindering the work by refusing to follow human safety protocols. Pete raised his hand and said the biggest problem was knowledge transfer, and he explained that they were fixing systems but not training local engineers because there was not enough time, and they were essentially creating the same dependency that had existed before. Lisa asked what he suggested. Pete said they needed to establish training centers and formal education programs, and they needed to require that every world accepting human aid also commit to training their own people in maintenance and repair, and it would slow down immediate repairs but would create long-term sustainability. Lisa agreed and issued new guidelines, and every human team was now required to spend half their time on training and education, and local engineers would work alongside human teams, learning the systems. Some worlds complained that this slowed down repairs, and Lisa replied that humanity was not interested in being the galaxy's permanent maintenance staff, and the choice was, learn to maintain your own systems, or do without. The dimensional fractures remained the biggest threat, and human scientists worked around the clock to understand them better and develop stabilization technology, and they had theories based on their 30 years of research, but implementing solutions was proving difficult. The fractures appeared randomly and grew unpredictably, and by the time a human team arrived with stabilization equipment, it was often too late. Dr. Nixel, who had dismissed human warnings, now worked closely with human scientists, and she said in a report to Lisa that they needed to establish a permanent monitoring network and early warning system, and they needed temporal shields deployed around populated areas before fractures appeared. Lisa asked how many shields they would need. Nixel calculated and said hundreds at minimum and thousands. Ideally, Lisa said humanity did not have the resources to build thousands of temporal shields. Nixel said then they needed to share the design and the manufacturing process, and let other species build them. That was a difficult decision, because temporal shield technology was advanced and giving it away meant losing one of humanity's advantages. But Lisa ultimately agreed because saving lives mattered more than maintaining leverage. The shield designs were shared, and manufacturing facilities across dozens of worlds began producing them, and within 6 months the network was operational, and fracture-related deaths dropped dramatically. Ambassador Vreen, who had lost her entire family in the Vreen homeworld, destruction came to Sentinel Prime 3 months into the reconstruction and asked to meet with Lisa. They sat in a small conference room and Vreen looked older and tired, but also somehow more alive than she had been. Vreen said she wanted to apologize personally, and she said the apology was inadequate and meaningless given what had happened, but she needed to say it anyway. Lisa said she appreciated it, and she said Vreen's earlier message had meant something, even though she had deleted it without responding. Vreen asked why humanity came back. Lisa thought about that for a while and said she was not entirely sure, but she thought it was because leaving people to die felt worse than the risk of being exploited again. And she said maybe that was weakness, or maybe it was strength, but either way it was who humans were. Vreen said that council leaders had been compiling a formal treaty and a new governmental structure, and they wanted human input on how to organize things going forward. Lisa said she would review it, but she made clear that humanity would have full voting rights and equal representation and veto power over any decisions affecting human resources, and there would be no return to the old system where humans did the work. While others made the decisions, Vreen said those terms would be accepted, and she said the old council was dead and everyone knew it, and what emerged from this would be genuinely new, or it would not exist at all. Over the following year, the galaxy slowly stabilized, and not everywhere, and not completely, but the catastrophic collapse had been halted and systems were being repaired and people were learning to maintain their